Alrighty guys, so we're going to do all of Act 4 in one fell swoop. This video might be a little bit longer, um, but it's because I want us to kind of get towards Act 5, where everything comes to a head and it kind of all just goes a little crazy. Um, so we have the Queen and the King, and she comes and she does exactly what Hamlet told her not to do. She goes straight to her husband, and she tells him exactly what Hamlet's done. She tells him that he killed Polonius. And the king says, "How shall this bloody deed be answered? What do we do? I mean, he's the prince, but at the same time, he killed a man. So do we leave him up to the courts? Do we use our money and our power to save him?" And he says, "Guildenstern, come here, come here. We have a problem." He says, "Hamlet has in his madness slain Polonius." And he dragged the body out of the room. So go find him, get the body, bring it here in the church. So that moves us towards Hamlet, Rosencrantz, and Guildenstern. They run to find him, and they say, "Where's the body?" And at this point, the queen told us he's gone to quarter it, to chop it up and get rid of it. And he says, "Oh, it's gone to the dust. It's gone." And they said, "Tell us where it is so that we can take to the chapel." And he says, "Do not believe it." He says, "Believe what?" He says, "That I can keep your counsel and not mine own. Besides, to be demanded of a sponge, what replication should be made by the son of a king?" So he's saying he's basically lost it at this point, and he's done with everyone. And he says, Rosencrantz says, "Take you me for a sponge, my lord?" So he calls him a sponge, and he says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Aye, sir, you're a sponge that it soaks up the king's countenance, his rewards, and his authorities." So in other words, yeah, you're a sponge for my uncle. I know that you basically do whatever he tells you to because you get his money. And he says, "I understand you not, my lord." He says, "I am glad of it. Knavish speech sleeps in a foolish ear." So he's basically saying, you're an idiot, so that's good. So he says, the body. He says, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern say, "Give us the body once again." And he says, "The body is with the king, but the king is not with the body. The king is a thing." So he's saying the kingship itself is not a person. It is a thing. And they say, "A thing, my lord?" He says, "Of nothing." So there's nothing to being a royal. Basically, it's a commentary on the monarchy and how it's so easily changeable with different people, and it's just a thing. There's nothing to it. So think of how powerful that statement is. This is 1601, so this is the ending of Elizabeth's monarchy, moving into we don't know who's going to take over for the kingdom. So he's got this political turmoil right here in the play. That's another thing you might want to do for a paper, which is really cool. If you're a history type of person, you might look into sort of the history that's being portrayed in the play or the historical roots. There's another part in here where there's talking about, you're actually going to talk about that in a second. Never mind. But so basically says, he's like, "You want to mess with me?" And so they run out the door. So in Act 4, Scene 3, the king says, "I've sent them to go find the body," and they come in, and he says, "Where is it?" And he says, "We don't know." Hamlet says that it's missing. So Hamlet comes in and he says, "Hamlet, where is Polonius?" And he says, "At supper." He says, "At supper, where?" And he says, "Not where he eats, but is where he is eaten." So in other words, a certain convocation of political worms are at him, so are eating him. So he makes this kind of very dark joke about where Polonius is, and he says, and the king says, "Alas, alas," and he says, "Oh, you can find him, you can smell him out, I'm sure, eventually." So he says, "You'll find the rotting body at some point." So Hamlet really has taken a very dark turn at this point. And the question of whether or not that's true madness starts to really take root here. And so the king, he says, he's basically, you'll smell him out in the stairwell. So he says, "Okay, go get the body," the king does. And he says, "Hamlet, you have to flee to England. You've committed a murder and we can protect you, but you have to leave, you have to go to England." So the king is thinking, this is my chance to get rid of Hamlet. It's awesome. So he doesn't actually, I mean, maybe he does care about Polonius, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like he's too concerned with Polonius and his emotion, his family or anything like that. It's more on how am I going to get rid of Hamlet. So in the section on top of page 1167, he finally comes out and says it. He says, by letters, I'm going to write, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, I'm going to write a letter. And by letters, congruing to that effect, the present death of Hamlet. Do it, England. So he's put a letter, basically, in Rosencrantz, he's going to put a letter in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's bag, writing to the King of England, saying, this man is coming to your shores, he's committed a murder, you need to put him to death. So that's how he's going to get around it without having to get his hands dirty. So in 4-4, we have Fort Bras is coming, and they realize Hamlet's at the shore waiting to get on the boat, and he sees young Fort Bras and his army, and he says, well, that's strange, why are they turning towards Poland? And he says, oh, did anybody tell you? The sailor does, he says, they're actually going to wage war on Poland now instead of Denmark. So Hamlet has this moment where he says, if that young idiot can lead 20,000 men to their deaths, why should I be so afraid to take off one man? So he has this moment of, can I really kill my uncle or not? And at the end of this very long speech, he talks about being, a coward versus being a man of action. And it's a wonderful sort of examination of the human soul and how does he negotiate those two desires, to avenge his father but to keep his soul. And at the bottom, he makes up his mind. He says, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. So he's made his decision. He's going to go back. He's going to go kill his uncles, he hopes. So then we have, in 4-5, we have Horatio and Gertrude and this other gentleman. And he says, Horatio stands there and he says, Ophelia's gone crazy. She says, well, I don't really want to talk to her. And then finally she says, okay, fine, let her come in. She says, to my sick soul, so remember, she's now feeling the guilt of everything she's done. As sin's true nature is, each toy seems prologue to some great amiss. So full of artless jealousy is guilt. It spills itself in fearing to be spilt. So she's saying, the more I try to repress my guilt, the more it comes out of me. So Ophelia comes in, and she basically has lost it. And she's walking around. All she does is sort of walk around and sing these haunting songs about death and flowers. So again, I don't want to give anything away, but this is a bit of foreshadowing here. So Ophelia keeps singing, and she sings one song that implies an interesting point. Around line 60, she says a song about a man who promises to marry a girl if she will go to bed with him, and then he leaves her because he won't marry her because she's not a virgin anymore, which, as you know, in this time period, women had to be a virgin to get married. It was a marker of social acceptability and purity. So there's a suggestion that Hamlet may or may not have taken her virginity as well, which could be a part of her madness. It could also just be that her father is dead, and that Hamlet has left and that everything has gone to pieces. So that is one of those questions that scholars like to raise, what really happened there. And it's something that, it could be very interesting to kind of examine. It's part of, Hamlet's increasing madness, or is he just committing himself fully to this part? So King says, Horatio, go follow her, make sure she's okay. And they hear this crazy knocking on the door, and then this guy bursts in, and the queen says, what's going on? And it's Laertes, it's Ophelia's brother. And he comes in and he says, where's the king? And he's kind of got this rabble of young guys from university. and the queen kind of grabs him, and she says, "Calm yourself, Laertes." And he kind of insults her. He says, "That drop of blood that's calm proclaims me bastard, cries cuckold to my father, brands the harlot even here between the chaste unsmirched brow of my true mother." So he basically calls the queen kind of a whore. And the king says, "Why are you so upset, Laertes? Calm down." And he says, "Where's my father? Dead." And he says, "I think you killed him." So basically it comes down to Laertes is going to kill the king because he needs to take revenge for his father. The king, in response, says, "I didn't kill your father." But he says, "But I'm not saying somebody in this castle really didn't." So he kind of leaves it open, and he kind of implies that somebody else close to them may have something to do with it. So he kind of sells Hamlet out, right? Because his whole plan is to get Hamlet killed. And then Ophelia comes back in, and she's kind of got the crazy hair and the singing and kind of like haunting. And Laertes sees her and says, "Dear maid, kind sister, sweet Ophelia, is it possible a young maid's wits should be as mortal as an old man's life? So is it possible that she should lose her wits and my father should die all at the same time?" And Ophelia is talking about all these different natural images, about the rosemary and the pansy, and he says, "A document and madness, thoughts and remembers fitted." So she really is crazy. So Laertes and the king have kind of a moment where he says, "Everything about my father's death is suspicious. You won't tell me, you won't go show me the trophy, the sword, no hatchment or of his bones, no noble rights, no formal ostentation. What is going on here?" And the Horatio comes back in. Oh, I'm sorry. Horatio goes to the sailor, and he gets a note from the sailor. That's what it is. And he says, in the note, it's from Hamlet, and he says, "Help me, Horatio. We've been taken over by pirates. I sent word back with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Basically, come save me." And so he's got a plan to kind of come back to England, or come back to Denmark, sorry, from England. So the last part here, Act 4, Scene 7, is the king and Laertes kind of coming into collusion with one another. So he says, "I'm really upset about all this. I need to revenge my father." And he says, without really letting him know a few times, he says, "Would you really do that? Would you really be willing to kill somebody who killed your father?" So he's getting Laertes to admit and commit to the act before he knows who it is. And lastly, he says, "I know who did this." And he says, "Would you really, if you are indeed your father," I'm on the 1176 now, "if you are indeed your father's son more than in words, in other words, would you really do more than just rail against the person who killed him?" He says, "I'd cut his throat in the church." That's a pretty bold statement. He says, "Okay, fine. I know who did it. It's Hamlet." So he kind of sets him up a little bit and then uses him as the instrument to kill Hamlet. So once again, we have the king making a plan to get rid of Hamlet without actually getting his hands dirty. So he comes up with basically a 3-part plan. He's basically gonna find a way to get Hamlet to have a duel with him. And if you know, like fencing in the Summer Olympic Games, it's not sharp. So he's gonna have a foil, which is like a fake sword. And they duel for points. He says, "I'm gonna take one of the ends of those and I'm gonna sharpen it so that it actually can, cut him and you can stab him through the heart." He says, "If that doesn't work, then I'm also going to poison the tip of it, just to make sure." He says, "And if that doesn't work, then I'm going to go ahead and poison my own drink and offer it to him because he's going to get thirsty after all this dueling anyways." So he's got this 3-pronged plan to get rid of Hamlet. And then in the middle of all this, the queen runs in and she tells him, "Your sister is drowned, Laertes." And so Ophelia is dead. And she tells him somehow the queen knows this. It's perhaps a little suspicious or something that she kind of knows this. But she says Ophelia was making a crown of flowers, and she was hanging it to dry on this tree. She was standing on the bough, and the bow basically broke, and Ophelia fell into the water, and she was laying there on her back with the, oh, sorry, my computer just, oh, sorry. She was laying there on her back with the crown of flowers kind of all around her. Her hair, she basically says, her clothes supported her, so she floated like a mermaid for a few minutes. And instead of getting up and out of the water, she just laid there and was singing her songs with the flowers all around her. If you've ever seen a version of Hamlet, you've seen this. It's kind of like very like beautiful but dark is always how her death scene is described. So anyways, and instead of getting out, the water starts to take on the weight of the clothes, and it says, and it sunk her, and she went down into the water singing with all these flowers around her. So the question is, did she die, or did she, was it an accident, or was it suicide? And most versions of this make it very abundantly clear they take on the suicide viewpoint of it. But it's ambiguous in the text. It says, and so that the garments heavy with their drink, so with all the water on them, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to a muddy death. So then Laertes kind of loses it again, because now he's lost his father and his sister. He runs out of the room, and the king's last word says, Gertrude, why'd you do that? Do you know how much I had to do to calm him down? God, you made it so difficult. So basically the king's back in it, like, oh, a girl just died. Oh, well, let's focus here on what we really need to focus on, which is keeping Laertes calm enough and with enough reason to do what he has to do. So then we move into Act 5, and I'll let you go ahead and read Act 5 at the beginning of next week, sorry. When you read Act 5, the first part is a little confusing. It has two clown characters, and it's a weird moment of lightness in the play. And it has a very famous line where Shakespeare, I mean, if you've ever seen a picture of a Hamlet play, you know it's with him and with the skull, and he's talking to the skull. That's where that line is. So if you get confused on that part of what exactly they're talking about, go ahead and go watch the video version of it. I think it'll make it a little more clear for you.